Everything on the farm seemed calm until the bull suddenly began fiercely attacking an old tree with a huge lump. The farmer decided to find out why and picked up a shovel. But when he started digging under the tree and saw what was hidden in the ground, he turned pale and regretted ever daring to do it. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The mornings on the ranch always carried a rhythm of their own, a rhythm that had pulsed through the land long before Marcus inherited it from his father. The rooster's crow was usually the first sound to break the silence, followed quickly by the creak of the old farmhouse settling against the cool dawn. The smell of coffee brewing drifted through the open window, mixing with the scent of dew on dry grass. For Marcus, this was life in its truest form. Predictable, steady, and grounded. He had worked this land since he was a boy, and every inch of it seemed stitched into his skin. The farmhouse itself stood like a guardian of time, its white paint chipped from years of harsh weather, its porch sagging just slightly under the weight of memory. To Marcus, it was more than a home. It was proof of his family's endurance. His father had built the barn with his own hands, and Marcus could still recall being a child, sitting in the dirt with a hammer too big for his hands, pretending he was helping. Now the barn, red and faded, leaned proudly on the horizon, its roof shimmering in the morning sun. By the time the first rays of sunlight spilled over the hills, Marcus was already out feeding the cattle. Dust rose beneath his boots as he moved with the familiarity of a man who had done the same chores countless times before. The herd was restless as always in the early hours, but his voice, deep and calm, steadied them. He knew each animal by the way it carried itself, the way it responded to his presence. Yet one stood apart from the rest. Rex, his bull, the most imposing creature on the farm. With a broad chest, thick neck, and horns that glistened like polished bone, Rex was a sight that commanded respect. Despite his size and power, Rex had never been an animal Marcus feared. The bull carried a steady temperament, a quiet dominance that seemed to reflect the farmer's own nature. Neighbors often remarked how unusual it was for such a powerful animal to be so disciplined, but Marcus believed it was simply a matter of mutual respect. He treated Rex not as a beast, but as a partner in the life they shared. In many ways, Rex was the cornerstone of his ranch, the embodiment of its strength and resilience. After the cattle were fed, Marcus turned to the smaller chores. The squeak of the pump at the well, the scraping sound of hay forked into stalls, the rhythm of work hummed through the morning air. Every task tied him to a long lineage of laborers who had bent their backs on this soil. The routine might have seemed dull to an outsider, but to Marcus it was a comfort. In a world that always seemed to be shifting and rushing, the ranch offered constancy. Here, the days unfolded like pages in a well-worn book, each one familiar yet essential. Still, the west field always carried a different weight. Beyond the main pastures and the rows of fencing that stretched like ribs across the land, that field had an air that was less welcoming. It wasn't that the grass grew poorly or that the soil lacked richness. It was the tree that stood there, an oak so old its branches seemed to scrape the sky, its trunk swollen with a massive, gnarled growth that bulged outward like a scar. The tree had been there longer than anyone could remember, long before Marcus's father first claimed the land. Children from town whispered about it, calling it haunted or cursed, though Marcus had always dismissed such talk as nonsense. To him, it was simply a relic of time, another part of the landscape. It was in the shadow of that oak that Rex began to change. The first time it happened, Marcus thought little of it. The bull had been grazing quietly when, without warning, he lowered his head and charged. His horns struck the thick trunk with a force that rattled the ground, echoing across the field like a drumbeat. Bark splintered and dust rose, and Rex pulled back only to slam forward again, his hooves tearing into the earth. Marcus shouted at him, but the bull seemed deaf to the world, consumed by a fury that had no target but the tree itself. The sight left Marcus unsettled. Rex was not prone to such behavior. He was no wild animal lashing out at shadows, no untamed beast. His aggression was deliberate, almost purposeful. And yet, after a few moments of violent assault, the bull simply stopped. He paced in front of the oak, snorting and pawing at the soil, before eventually wandering back to the herd as if nothing had happened. Marcus tried to dismiss it, telling himself there must have been some scent that had disturbed the bull, perhaps a fox or a stray coyote lingering too close. But deep inside, unease gnawed at him. As the day wore on, Marcus couldn't shake the image from his mind. He tried to bury himself in work, mending a fence that sagged along the north line, fixing a loose hinge on the barn door, checking the water troughs. Yet, every time he paused, his thoughts drifted back to the west field, to the sound of Rex's horns striking wood with violent intent. The bull's aggression hadn't been random. There was a focus in it, a determination that Marcus couldn't explain. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus leaned against the fence and watched Rex graze. The bull looked calm again, almost serene, but Marcus found no comfort in it. The oak loomed in the distance, its swollen trunk casting a long shadow across the pasture. For the first time, Marcus felt as though the tree wasn't just a part of the land, but something separate, something that stood with its own presence. He tried to tell himself it was foolishness, that trees did not carry secrets and bulls did not act as messengers. Yet, even as he turned toward the house, the unease lingered, following him like a shadow. Life on the ranch was supposed to be predictable, steady as the sunrise. But that night, as Marcus sat on his porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, he felt the first stirrings of something he could not name. Rex had never lied to him, never shown madness without reason. If the bull saw something in that oak, perhaps Marcus needed to look closer. The thought left him restless as he finally retired for the night, the silence of the farmhouse pressing down like a weight. He closed his eyes, but his mind wandered back to the west field, to the old oak with its grotesque growth, to the sound of horns striking bark again and again. And though he tried to tell himself tomorrow would be like any other day, deep down he already knew the rhythm of his life had shifted. The land was stirring with something hidden, and the first crack in its quiet surface had already appeared. The following morning dawned as if nothing at all had shifted. The same pale light spread across the horizon, the same chill clung to the air before the sun rose fully, and the same motions filled Marcus's body as he stepped into his boots and shrugged into his worn jacket. The routine held, but his mind would not fall into it as easily as before. No matter how he tried, the image of Rex colliding with the oak, horn after horn against that gnarled trunk, was as vivid in his mind as the creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. He moved through his chores with practiced precision, filling troughs, throwing feed, checking gates, but all the while his eyes darted toward the west field. From the moment he let the herd out, he knew where Rex would go. The bull wasted no time, breaking from the others with a low rumble that rolled out of his chest. Marcus's heart sank even before it happened. Rex lowered his massive head, pawed the ground as though squaring off against some invisible opponent, and then thundered across the grass toward the oak tree. The impact echoed like a gunshot across the pasture. Bark cracked and splintered, sending bits of wood scattering. Dust rose from the earth, catching in the early sunlight as the bull wheeled around and struck again. The sound reverberated through Marcus's bones, filling him with an unease that was no longer so easy to dismiss. This was not coincidence, not mere agitation. It was compulsion. The other cattle scattered wide, their hooves drumming in panic, while Rex stood locked in a battle with an unmoving adversary, his breath steaming in the cool air. Marcus hurried forward, shouting, his voice carrying across the field, but the bull did not respond. Rex's eyes burned with a focus that Marcus had never seen before, wild and unrelenting, until at last, after a frenzy of violent charges, he stopped. His sides heaved, nostrils flared, and yet he seemed unwilling to move more than a few paces from the oak. He circled it slowly, head low, as if expecting it to move against him. Then, with a sudden snort, he stomped the earth and turned away, ambling back toward the others as if the episode had drained all fight from him. Marcus stood still in the field long after the cattle had settled, staring at the oak. Its presence seemed heavier now, the grotesque swelling of its trunk even more pronounced in the rising light. He could not escape the thought that the bull was trying to tell him something. But what could a tree hide? It was nonsense, he told himself again, only this time the conviction faltered. As the day stretched on, Marcus busied himself with repairs along the fence line, hammering boards back into place, though his eyes strayed again and again toward the west. He worked until his muscles ached, hoping sweat would wash away the unease that coiled tighter around him. But as evening settled and the sky painted itself in dusky hues, the oak loomed like a silhouette carved against the horizon, impossible to ignore. That night, the ranch felt different. The wind whispered through the fields in strange rhythms, and the dogs barked without reason, their attention fixed toward the west. Marcus sat on the porch, the glow of his lantern flickering against the dark, and thought he heard it too, a dull, distant sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. At first, he dismissed it as his imagination, the echo of Rex's charges still playing tricks on his mind. But then it came again, low and hollow, as though something beneath the soil shifted or called out. Sleep did not come easily. When at last he drifted into restless dreams, he found himself walking toward the oak again and again, the ground soft and yielding under his feet. In his dream, the tree swelled larger and larger, its bark twisting like flesh, the knot on its side pulsing as if alive. He woke with his sheets damp and his chest tight, heart hammering in the silence of the house. The following morning, he told himself it had only been a dream, but unease clung to him all the same. He moved slower through his chores, watching Rex with guarded eyes. The bull stayed near the herd this time, but Marcus knew better than to feel relief. It was not gone. Whatever drove the animal, it was waiting, biding, restless as a storm gathering strength in the distance. By midday, he found himself standing in the west field again, staring at the tree. The ground felt different here, softer, like a sponge beneath his boots. He shifted his weight, pressing down, and the soil gave a little too easily. He crouched to study it more closely, running his fingers across the earth, and found it cool and damp even under the sun. Something about it seemed unnatural, as though the land had been disturbed long ago and never quite settled back. The oak itself was no comfort. Its trunk bore the marks of Rex's relentless assault, deep grooves and broken bark, yet the tree stood strong, its limbs sprawling upward, indifferent to the damage. The swelling at its side, the massive growth that distorted its shape, seemed almost to bulge further out now that Marcus looked at it in daylight. It resembled not just a tumor of wood, but something pressing outward, straining to escape. That night, the unease deepened. The dogs paced the porch, growling low, their ears pricked toward the field. Marcus tried to drown the sound of the wind with the radio, but the faintest suggestion of that dull, subterranean thump reached him still. It came in intervals, steady as a heartbeat. He found himself holding his breath, waiting for it each time, and when it came, the sound carried a weight that rattled his bones. He tried to tell himself he was imagining things, that fatigue and worry played tricks, but deep down, the certainty grew that something lay beneath that oak, something the bull had sensed long before Marcus's mind dared to wander there. He poured himself another cup of coffee, though it was late, though sleep was already impossible, and sat staring through the window toward the west field. For the first time in all his years on the ranch, Marcus felt as though he did not truly know his land. The soil that had cradled his family's work for generations now seemed to hold its secrets too tightly. He thought again of Rex, of the fury that had driven the bull to strike the tree, and wondered if animals could feel the weight of history in ways men could not. As the lantern flickered and shadows stretched across the wooden walls, Marcus understood one truth with a clarity that chilled him. Whatever haunted that oak would not leave him be. It would return with the sunrise, as sure as the crow of the rooster and the crack of hooves on dry earth, and when it did, he would no longer be able to look away. Marcus rose the next morning with his body heavy from restless sleep. The dreams had lingered, clinging like cobwebs to his thoughts, their whispers carrying into his waking hours. He went through the motions of the morning as though by instinct alone, pulling on his boots, pouring coffee, stepping out into the crisp dawn, but there was no calm in him any more. Every sound seemed sharpened, every shadow stretched too long, every breath drawn in unease. The ranch that had once felt like an extension of himself had begun to feel unfamiliar, like a place waiting for him to acknowledge something he could not yet face. Rex stayed close to the herd that morning, his massive frame hulking quietly among the cows. Yet, even in his calm, Marcus saw tension. The bull's muscles twitched beneath his hide, his tail flicked with nervous agitation, and his eyes slid again and again toward the west field. Marcus followed his gaze to the oak. The tree stood there as always, crooked against the sky, its swollen trunk bulging grotesquely. The sight sent a shiver through him. He tried to turn his eyes away, but his mind dragged him back. The memory of his father's stories began to stir, tales Marcus had always dismissed as idle rambling, campfire nonsense told to children who needed to be warned away from wandering too far at night. His father had spoken of strange happenings on their land, of men who vanished without explanation, and of nights when voices seemed to call out from the soil itself. There were whispers, too, about the west field, always the west field, where the oak stood like a sentry. The old folks had warned never to dig there, never to disturb what lay beneath. Marcus remembered laughing at such warnings when he was young, proud to believe in reason and soil and sweat rather than in superstitions. But now, with Rex driven mad and the ground itself sounding as though it carried a heartbeat, those old words no longer seemed so foolish. He leaned on the fence, staring at the oak, and felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping over him, the sense that he was being watched. The tree's swollen growth jutted outward, its bark split and scarred where Rex had struck, and Marcus could not shake the image that something inside pressed to be free. He told himself it was only wood, only a deformity grown over decades, but the thought brought no relief. The tree felt alive in ways a tree should not. All day he worked, moving hay, repairing troughs, oiling hinges, anything to keep his hands busy. But his thoughts circled the same place like a hawk over prey. Each time he lifted his head, his eyes found the oak. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard Rex's horns striking bark, the echo traveling into his bones. He tried to remind himself that land was nothing more than earth and stone, that trees were nothing but roots and branches, but doubt was already gnawing at him. That evening, as the sun sank and shadows deepened, Marcus sat at his kitchen table staring at the tools laid out before him. His lonesome supper sat cold on the plate. He had fetched the old spade from the shed earlier, the one his father had used to turn the soil when he first worked the land. The handle was worn smooth by hands long gone, the blade rusted from decades of use, yet it felt heavy with a kind of purpose. He set it beside a lantern, a pair of gloves, and a small hunting knife, as though gathering armor for a battle he did not yet understand. Fear and resolve warred inside him. Part of him longed to forget it all, to leave the tree alone and go on living as before, to pretend that Rex's fury was nothing more than an animal's madness. But another part, the stronger part, knew that ignoring the oak would not make the unease fade. It was already rooted in him, a question demanding an answer. He could not walk his land each day knowing there was something beneath it, something that stirred enough to rattle his bull and unsettle his sleep. When the last light of day slipped away and the darkness wrapped itself around the ranch, Marcus found himself standing at the edge of the west field. The lantern in his hand threw trembling light against the grass, and his shadow stretched long across the earth. Rex lingered in the distance, his breath fogging in the cool night air, his gaze locked on Marcus with an intensity that felt almost human. The oak loomed ahead, its massive silhouette blotting out the stars. The swollen growth on its trunk caught the lantern's glow, and for a moment it looked like a monstrous eye staring back at him. Marcus gripped the handle of the spade tighter, his breath quickening, but he stepped forward. He knelt at the base of the tree and pressed the blade into the soil. The earth gave reluctantly, resisting as though it did not wish to be disturbed. He dug only a few strokes before the fear overcame him. The sound of the spade slicing into the ground seemed too loud, echoing through the stillness of the night. The lantern flame flickered as though a breath had passed over it, though the air was calm. His heart pounded, sweat gathered at his temples despite the chill, and he stopped. He leaned on the spade, staring at the dark soil already clinging to the blade, and felt a wave of dread wash over him. The silence of the field pressed in on him. He thought of the stories again, of the warnings never to dig, of the disappearances, of the whispered curses tied to the land. The weight of it pressed against his chest until his breath came shallow. With a suddenness born of fear, Marcus pulled the spade from the earth and backed away. He turned and walked quickly across the field, the lantern swaying in his grip, the shadows chasing him back toward the house. On the porch, he set the spade down and lowered himself heavily onto the steps. His body shook with the release of tension, his breath ragged. He stared out across the darkened field where the oak loomed unseen, and he knew he had failed to follow through. Yet even in his retreat, resolve coiled tighter within him. He could not run forever. The questions would not leave, and neither would Rex's restless gaze. As he sat there under the quiet sky, Marcus realized he had crossed a threshold. He had placed the spade in the soil, however briefly, and in doing so had acknowledged the truth he had long resisted. Something lay beneath that oak, and it demanded to be uncovered. His fear had forced him back this night, but his determination was stronger still. The next time he would not turn away. The lantern sputtered, then steadied again. Marcus looked toward the horizon where the faint glow of dawn would soon rise. He knew sleep would not come, not while the tree stood waiting, not while his bull lingered as if guarding a secret he himself was too hesitant to unearth. The decision had already been made, even if his hands had faltered. Tomorrow he would dig. Tomorrow he would face what the land had been hiding all these years. When morning broke, Marcus felt the decision he had made the night before sitting heavy in his chest. He had sworn to himself that he would not falter again, that he would not let fear drive him back from the truth the land demanded he face. The spade still rested on the porch where he had left it, its blade caked with dark soil from his aborted attempt. He picked it up with a firmness that surprised even him, as though in the night his resolve had been tempered by something deeper than courage. This was no longer curiosity. It was necessity. The sun was still low when he crossed the dew-covered grass toward the west field. His boots left wet prints behind him, and the dogs trailed a few paces before stopping short, whining softly as though they too felt the weight of the task. The air carried an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional call of a crow overhead. Marcus set his jaw, adjusted his grip on the spade, and approached the oak. The tree stood before him in all its crooked grandeur, its limbs twisting skyward like the arms of something both ancient and unwilling to let go. The swollen growth on its trunk seemed even larger now, the light of dawn casting deep shadows in its crevices. Rex was there too, farther off but watching intently, his massive frame rigid with alertness. The bull no longer charged the tree, but his attention had not waned. His gaze followed Marcus as though urging him onward, demanding he finally uncover what lay beneath. Marcus pressed the spade into the earth at the base of the oak. The soil resisted at first, thick and compact, but he put his weight into it, forcing the blade deeper. The ground yielded grudgingly, as though reluctant to give up what it held. He worked steadily, sweat beading at his brow despite the cool morning air, his breath quickening with each plunge and heave. The smell of damp soil rose up, rich and earthy, carrying with it a sense of history buried too long. The more he dug, the more he realized the ground was not natural here. The soil was darker, packed in layers that spoke of deliberate hands rather than time alone. It unsettled him, this knowledge that someone, long before him, had chosen this place to hide something. Each shovelful turned the unease tighter in his stomach, but his hands did not slow. He felt as though the act itself was no longer his choice, but an obligation pressed upon him by generations past. Hours slipped by. The sun climbed higher, heating his back, while the hole deepened before him. His arms ached, but he pressed on, driven by something beyond exhaustion. He paused only when the spade struck against something solid. The sound was unmistakable, a hollow clang that reverberated through the ground and up his arms. Marcus froze, his breath caught in his throat. He knelt and brushed the loose soil away with trembling hands. Beneath the dirt, he glimpsed the edge of metal, corroded and rough but undeniably shaped by human hands. His pulse thundered as he scraped more away, revealing a flat surface running wide beneath the earth. It was no rock. It was a container, large and rectangular, its edges softened by time but still defined enough to be unmistakable. Rust coated its surface, the reddish flakes crumbling beneath his fingers, yet the weight of its presence was undeniable. Marcus sat back on his heels, staring at it, his chest tight with a mix of triumph and dread. He had found what the land had hidden, what Rex had tried to reveal. For a long moment, he could do nothing but stare. The air seemed heavier now, as if the very field held its breath. Even the birds had gone silent, their songs choked off by the weight of what lay exposed. Marcus wiped the sweat and soil from his brow and forced himself to keep going. He widened the hole, clearing more earth away from the container, exposing its corners and the top surface. The thing was massive, far larger than he had expected, buried deep, as though whoever had placed it there had never meant for it to see daylight again. He pressed his hands against the metal. It was cold, unnaturally so, the chill seeping into his palms despite the warmth of the sun above. He pushed, testing its weight, but it barely shifted. Whatever it contained, it had been meant to stay hidden. His breath came heavy, each exhale a cloud of dirt and sweat. He sat back again, glancing toward Rex. The bull stood motionless at the edge of the field, his eyes locked on Marcus, his body still as stone. There was something unsettling in the way he stood, almost reverent, as though he too understood the significance of the moment. Marcus's mind churned with questions. Who had buried it? How long had it lain here beneath the roots of this twisted oak? And what did it hold that could drive a bull into madness, that could unsettle the land itself? The thought sent a chill through him, but he did not stop. His hands returned to the soil, clawing and scraping until more of the container lay revealed. Its surface bore dents and scars, the mark of years pressed under earth and root, but its shape remained intact. At last, he sat back, the spade clattering to the side, and wiped the grime from his hands onto his jeans. He had uncovered enough to know this was no mere relic of junk tossed away. It had been placed here, deliberately, entombed beneath the oak like an offering, or a secret. He could feel it radiating something intangible, a weight beyond its rust and steel. He knew he could not leave it now, not when it had revealed itself so completely. But the size and weight of it mocked his strength. He would not be able to pull it free alone. He rested on the edge of the hole, breathing hard, the enormity of what he had uncovered pressing against his mind. His eyes flicked back to Rex, who lowered his head and let out a low, rumbling snort that rolled across the field. It was a sound not of anger, but of expectation, as though confirming what Marcus already knew. The work was not finished. The sun dipped lower as the day waned, shadows stretching long across the ground. Marcus gathered his tools, his body aching with the effort of his labor, and stood staring down into the pit. The container gleamed faintly in the fading light, a silent testament to whatever secrets it held. He would need more strength, more tools, perhaps even more hands to uncover it fully. But for now, he had pierced the veil. The earth had given up its first truth. As he walked back toward the farmhouse, his body weary but his mind alight, Marcus felt both dread and anticipation. The quiet routine of ranch life had been broken forever. He had unearthed something buried by time and intention, and there was no turning back. The oak stood behind him, dark against the sky, its swollen trunk looming over the disturbed soil, and Rex lingered still, watching. The land had been guarding its secret for years untold, but now it had chosen him to see it through. That night, when Marcus sat again on the porch, with the spade leaned beside him and the stars cold overhead, he could still feel the clang of metal ringing in his bones. The first discovery had been made, and though he did not yet know its meaning, he knew one thing with certainty. He would not stop until he uncovered it all. Marcus awoke with the dawn already burning in his chest. The image of the corroded surface buried beneath the oak had followed him into his dreams, and when he opened his eyes, the weight of it pressed down as if it were not only in the earth but also in his very soul. He had unearthed enough to know that what lay there was no accident, no forgotten scrap of metal abandoned in the soil. It was deliberate, purposeful, and waiting. The thought gnawed at him, filling him with both dread and urgency. The morning routine was a blur. He moved among the herd, filled troughs, scattered feed, checked the fences, but his eyes never left the west field for long. Rex watched him steadily, the bull's usual calm now stretched thin by a strange intensity. Marcus swore he could feel these amber eyes fixed on him, as if the animal had appointed itself witness to every step Marcus would take. And perhaps, in some way, Rex had. The tools from yesterday lay stacked by the porch, dirt still clinging to their blades. Marcus gathered them without hesitation, his hands working faster than his thoughts. He fetched an old wrench, a crowbar, and a heavier lantern, the kind his father had once used in the barn. The box, if it was truly a box, was far too large and heavy for him to drag free, but he could open it there, in the earth where it had rested for so long. The idea of moving it felt wrong anyway, like tearing a body from its grave. Better to let it reveal itself where it had been buried. By the time the sun had climbed above the horizon, he was back at the oak, standing over the hole where yesterday's labor had exposed one face of the container. The metal gleamed faintly in the morning light, scarred with time, streaked with corrosion, but still whole. The sight of it sent a tremor through him as though the ground itself hummed beneath his boots. He set to work immediately, widening the pit, shoveling dirt away from the edges until the container's corners became clearer. The air grew warmer as the day stretched on, the heat clinging to his skin, but Marcus hardly noticed. His breath came steady, his arms strained, his shirt clung damp to his back, yet he pressed forward. Hours passed, the sun arched higher, and the box emerged further from its shroud of soil. At last he knelt beside it, brushing the earth from its surface with his bare hands. The rust flaked beneath his touch, but the steel beneath was stubborn, unyielding. He ran his fingers along the lid, tracing the seams that separated it from the body. A lock mechanism, long corroded, protruded on one side, but it was bent and weakened by age. He tested it with the wrench, twisting until the old metal groaned and snapped. The sound cracked through the silence like a rifle shot. Marcus froze, his breath caught, half expecting something to rise from the soil in protest, but the air remained still, save for the faint stir of wind through the oak's leaves. He slid the crowbar beneath the lid, his hands shaking with effort and anticipation. The steel groaned in defiance, the rusted hinges squealing as though protesting the intrusion. The sound cut through the field, harsh and grating, setting Marcus's teeth on edge. He pushed harder, the veins in his arms straining, until with a sudden lurch the lid shifted. A breath of air escaped from the box, stale and sour, the scent of rot and age that had been sealed away for decades. Marcus recoiled slightly, gagging on the foulness, but forced himself to lean closer. The interior revealed itself slowly in the dim light. At first it was only shadows, then shapes began to emerge as the lantern's glow flickered over them. Bundles of papers, yellowed with time, tied together with string that had frayed to threads. A stack of photographs, their edges curled and faces blurred with age. a pair of small wooden boxes, their surfaces scarred and brittle. Marcus reached in carefully, his hands trembling, and lifted one of the photographs. The image showed men standing in a field not unlike his own, their clothes decades out of style, their expressions stern. Behind them, faint but unmistakable, stood the oak, smaller then but already marked by the swelling on its trunk. A chill coursed through him. This was not just a container of forgotten things. It was a record. A message from the past deliberately placed beneath the tree that had grown into a sentinel over it. He set the photograph aside and reached for the bundle of papers, the brittle sheets crackling under his fingers. Names scrawled in ink, ledgers of transactions, lists of items exchanged, land deeds, agreements, and signatures of men he had never heard of. Some pages were stained dark, as though with water, though a part of him could not shake the thought of blood. Deeper still, beneath the papers, lay objects wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled one free and carefully peeled the covering back. A revolver lay within, its metal tarnished, its grip worn smooth by hands long gone. His breath caught as he turned it in the lantern light, the weapon still carrying a weight of menace despite the decades. He replaced it carefully, unease prickling his skin, and reached for the second cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a small journal, its leather cover cracked and fragile. He opened it to the first page, the handwriting inside neat but faded. The words were fragmented, many lines blurred or eaten away by time, but what remained spoke of meetings held in secrecy, of disputes over land, of threats whispered in the dark. The writer spoke of violence, of fear, of obligations he dared not refuse. And then, further still, of disappearances. Marcus's eyes raced across the page, his pulse quickening with each word. Whoever had written this had feared for his life, had seen things that no one else was meant to know. Marcus sat back, the journal trembling in his hands. He looked toward Rex, who had moved closer now, standing just beyond the edge of the pit. The bull's eyes glowed in the lantern's reflection, unblinking, steady. It was as if Rex understood that something had shifted, that a truth long buried had finally been disturbed. The air around the tree seemed heavier, charged with an unseen weight. Marcus felt it pressing into his chest, making each breath shallow. He placed the journal back in the box and stared down at the contents again. The papers, the photographs, the weapon, the remnants of lives that had intersected here in violence and secrecy. This was not simply a relic of the past. It was a crime entombed in his soil, a story that had been meant to vanish, but had instead endured beneath roots and dirt until he uncovered it. He lowered the lid back over the box, the squeal of the hinges sharp in the silence. His hands were filthy, his body aching, his mind spinning, but he knew there was no retreat now. The oak was no longer just a tree, and his land was no longer simply earth to till. They were keepers of a story, one that had found him whether he wished it or not. As the day faded and the first stars emerged, Marcus sat by the edge of the pit, staring into the dark field beyond. Rex lingered there, silent and calm, his great frame a shadow against the fading sky. The ranch had changed forever. What he had uncovered beneath the layers of time had opened a door that would never close. Marcus did not sleep that night. He had tried, lying on his back with his eyes shut, but the moment he drifted even slightly, the images came crowding in. Sepia photographs with nameless faces staring into the lens, the revolver gleaming faintly in the lantern light, the pages of the journal scrawled with words that felt like whispers rising from the grave. When dawn finally broke and the rooster crowed, He felt as though he had aged years rather than hours. His hands shook as he poured coffee, and he left the cup untouched on the table as he stepped back outside, pulled once more toward the west field. The pit waited for him, yawning in the earth at the base of the oak, its dark soil clinging to the edges like a wound that refused to close. The box sat there with its lid askew, not quite sealed, as though the contents had begun to seep into the world again after decades of silence. Marcus crouched beside it, his breath misting in the cool morning air, and pulled the journal back into his hands. The leather was stiff, fragile, its cover cracking as he opened it to the next set of pages. The words were broken, whole lines eaten by mold or smudged into obscurity, but enough remained to shape meaning. The writer spoke of gatherings, men who came by night carrying sacks and tools, whispering by lantern light. They argued about land boundaries, about who controlled the fields and who held claim to the water running beneath them. But the words soon darkened. There were mentions of men disappearing, of debts settled not by coin, but by blood. The writer confessed his fear, his sense of being trapped in something larger than himself, of being a witness to things he could not speak of aloud. Marcus turned the brittle pages with care, his pulse quickening. He read of names he did not recognize but that felt eerily close, as if the land itself still remembered them. He found a passage that described a night when a man had been dragged into the field near the oak, bound and beaten, never seen again. The journal trailed off into shaky scrawls, the ink smeared as though written by trembling hands. Marcus closed it quickly, his chest tight, the horror of it settling like lead in his stomach. He lifted one of the photographs again, holding it up to the daylight. The faces were clearer now, and behind them the oak loomed smaller but still marked by that grotesque swelling in its trunk. The men posed stiffly, their eyes hard, their mouths unsmiling. Their presence was unsettling, a row of ghosts staring across time at him. He shuffled through the stack, each picture revealing more of the same men, sometimes with others, sometimes alone, always near the tree. It was as though they had chosen it as a stage, as if the oak itself had been a part of their rituals. Marcus set the photographs aside and studied the revolver again. He turned it slowly in his hands, feeling its weight. The metal was tarnished, but it remained intact, functional even. The thought chilled him. This was no token placed gently in the earth. It was a weapon, a tool of violence, buried perhaps to conceal its use. He placed it back in its wrapping, careful not to linger on the idea of whose hand might have last gripped it, and what they had done with it beneath this same tree. As the day stretched on, Marcus remained by the box, piecing together fragments of the past from the relics within. The documents, faded and stained, revealed land deeds, records of ownership disputes, and agreements written in legal terms that meant little to him but carried the weight of conflict. There were letters, too, crumbling at the edges, speaking of promises broken and threats delivered. One in particular caught his eye. A letter without a signature, written in a hurried hand, warning the recipient to stay away from the west field if he valued his life. Marcus's hands went cold as he read it, the words echoing like an accusation across the decades. By afternoon, his mind felt frayed, pulled taut by the voices of the past. He closed the lid on the box, unable to look at it any longer, though the weight of its revelations still pressed heavily on him. He sat back against the oak, his body trembling, his heart unsettled. He thought of his father, of his grandfather, of all those who had walked this land before him. Had they known? Had they chosen silence, living with the secret rather than exposing it? The thought unsettled him even more. Rex stood near, silent and unmoving, his eyes locked on Marcus. The bull had not charged the oak again, had not raged against the tree since the box was uncovered. Instead, he stood as though guarding, as though acknowledging that his role was finished, his warning delivered. There was calm in his posture, but also something that felt almost like expectation. Marcus rose slowly, dusting the soil from his hands, and met the animal's gaze. For the first time, he felt that Rex was more than a beast of burden, more than muscle and horn. He was a sentinel, too, a creature attuned to truths men had long buried. That night, as Marcus sat on the porch once more, the stars stretched endless above him, but the piece of the sky could not reach him. His mind replayed the images again and again. The faceless men in the photographs, the warnings scribbled in letters, the journal entries filled with dread. He felt as though he had been drawn into a story that had no end, a thread of history woven into his land that demanded to be followed. His hands shook as he lifted his cup of coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to steady him. Sleep eluded him once again. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the oak standing in the field, its swollen trunk bulging like a scar, its roots spreading deep into secrets too long hidden. He heard the voices of men long dead, whispering in the soil, their warnings and threats echoing through time. The revolver gleamed in the dark of his mind, a symbol of violence that would not fade. And through it all, Rex's eyes glowed like embers, unblinking, steady, a reminder that the land itself had chosen Marcus to uncover its truth. When the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, Marcus rose with it, weary but resolved. The past had reached for him through the soil, and he could not retreat now. He had seen enough to know that his land was not just a place of crops and cattle, but a grave of history, a ledger of blood and silence waiting to be reckoned with. And though fear gnawed at him, though uncertainty clawed at his every step, he knew the journey was not yet complete. The box was not only an end, but a beginning, and the shadows of the past would follow him until he brought them fully into the light. The morning broke over the ranch with the same soft glow it always had, yet Marcus felt as though the land around him had been altered beyond recognition. He walked out onto the porch and let the cool air settle into his lungs, but even the freshness of dawn could not cut through the heaviness pressing on his chest. The pit at the base of the oak was hidden by distance, but he knew it was there, gaping and patient, holding the box that had rewritten everything he thought he knew about his farm. He had not moved it. He had not even closed the lid tightly again. It seemed wrong to force the earth to swallow its secret after it had already yielded it, as though covering it would be a denial of the truth. He went about his chores as though by instinct, scattering feed, checking water, moving the cattle, but every action felt hollow. The steady rhythm of ranch life had once been his comfort, the pattern of his days as natural as breathing, but now it was an echo of something he could never return to. The photographs, the journal, the revolver, those images lived in him now, heavy as stone. Even the ground beneath his boots felt different, no longer the firm foundation of his life, but a fragile skin stretched over untold depths. Rex stood apart from the herd near the west field. He was calm again, no longer ramming the oak, no longer snorting with wild defiance. He simply stood watch, his gaze steady and frame unmoving, as though guarding the very secret Marcus had unearthed. The bull's stillness unnerved him. It was not the peace of an animal content, but the silence of a sentinel whose duty had been fulfilled. Marcus wondered if Rex had known all along. If animals carried instincts that reached deeper than human reason, instincts that bound them to the truth of the land in ways men had forgotten. All through the day, Marcus found his thoughts circling the same questions. What did the men in the photographs truly want with his land? What had become of the lives mentioned in the journal, the disappearances hinted at but never explained? And why the oak? Why had they chosen that tree, that field, to bury their deeds? Each question clawed at him, refusing rest, until his head ached with the weight of them. He could not escape the realization that his land, his inheritance, had never truly belonged to him alone. It carried with it a history darker than he could have imagined, a history that now sat in his hands, demanding recognition. That evening, he sat on the porch as the sky deepened from gold to purple, the cup of coffee cooling untouched beside him. He stared across the field towards the silhouette of the oak, the swollen trunk looming against the horizon. The tree was no longer just a tree to him. It was a monument, a witness, a guard that had held its silence until the moment came for him to break it. The thought both humbled and terrified him. He felt as though he had been chosen, drawn into a narrative larger than himself, one that tied him to the very soil he worked. The choice weighed on him. He could keep the discovery to himself, bury the box again, and pretend nothing had changed, live out his days in uneasy silence with the truth lodged like a stone in his heart. Or he could bring it forward, carry the evidence to town, speak of what he had found, and tear open the past for all to see. One path promised a heavy solitude, the other a storm of questions he might not want answered. Either way, his life of quiet anonymity was gone. Night fell over the ranch, and the stars came out sharp and clear. Marcus felt their cold brilliance above him and thought of how small he was against the enormity of the universe, and yet how deeply entangled he had become in the threads of his own land's history. He walked out into the yard, the boards of the porch creaking behind him, and stopped at the fence to look once more toward the oak. The wind whispered through its leaves, carrying a sound that seemed almost like a sigh. He thought of the men who had stood beneath it decades ago, their faces captured forever in faded photographs, their secrets buried with the box he had now uncovered. They were gone, but the land remembered. Rex lifted his head as Marcus approached, the bull's eyes gleaming in the starlight. He did not move, did not snort or stamp as he once had. He only watched, his gaze steady, a quiet dignity about him that felt almost human. Marcus reached out, resting his hand against the wooden fence, and for a moment the two of them stood locked in silent understanding. The bull had led him here, had forced his hand, and now stood calm as though his task was complete. Marcus turned back toward the farmhouse, the weight of his decision still unsettled, but the path before him clearer. He could no longer pretend ignorance. The truth had been unearthed, and whether he chose to guard it or to reveal it, it would shape everything that came after. His ranch, once a sanctuary of routine, was now something more, a stage where the past and present had collided, where silence had finally broken. He paused at the porch, looking back one final time toward the west field. The oak loomed there, dark and watchful, its swollen trunk catching the faint glimmer of starlight. Rex stood nearby, a silent guardian, his body outlined against the night. Marcus felt a strange calm then, a sense of closure even as the questions lingered. The land had given him its secret, and now it was his to bear. As he stepped back inside and let the door close softly behind him, Marcus knew with certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The soil beneath his boots, the air over his fields, the tree at the edge of the west pasture, all of it had changed. And in that change, he too had been altered. He was no longer just a farmer tending cattle and crops. He was the keeper of a story buried beneath roots and time, a story the land itself had chosen him to uncover. The night deepened, the ranch settling into silence, but Marcus sat awake by the window, watching the horizon. What began with a bull's fury against an old oak had become a reckoning, a call from the past demanding to be heard. The oak stood still, but its presence loomed larger than ever, a reminder that the earth remembers, and sooner or later it tells its truths. If you want to know what secrets might be hiding just beneath the surface of everyday life, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Don't miss our next story. It could be even more shocking than this one. Check out the other videos on this channel for more unbelievable discoveries, and share this video with your friends so they can see it too. You won't believe what's coming next.